This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The incoming mayor of Germantown, tonight on Behind the Headlines. Publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Mike Palazzolo, the newly elected mayor of Germantown. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
You are an alderman for the last how many years?
10 years.
10 years.
3 terms, and I am in the middle of midterm of my 3rd term.
Okay. And you are replacing Sharon Goldsworthy, who's been on the show, particularly during the schools consolidation, deconsolidation, and so on. She'd been in office for 20-something years. Big shoes to follow.
Well, yes, very much so, and I'm not sure if I'm replacing her. I'm following her in my eyes, and she's very much been a mentor to many leaders in Germantown for a number of years, and she's had great amount of dignity and grace as far as being our mayor, and it'll be very hard shoes to fill, but I'm very excited about the role of Germantown, the role of mayor.
All right, and let's start just some basics. Your priorities as you take over this office in a 4-year term. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I spent most of this calendar year, starting in mid-February, walking the neighborhoods of Germantown, and literally we have about 14,000 households. I can't, say that I've knocked on every single door, but pretty close to it. And over that time, I kind of forged a platform, a plan. It's about 6 pages. It's built on 3 guiding principles: community vitality, economic development, and education. And of course, there are sub-principles in those 3 platform items. So really the first thing we'd like to get started with in Germantown in 2015, in the calendar year, is reworking our 2020 plan. It is a blueprint for a vision and a mission for the city of Germantown. And it's established by our citizenry. We did this back in 2003. It takes about a year. We have anywhere from 400 to 600 citizens that come together, form a steering committee, and then several different committees. And we pretty much define what the city would like to see as far as services, and also kind of what are we going to look like in 2040. So it'll be our next generational plan.
And talk a little, the 2020 plan, which I have here, I can't really hold up, but it talked about economics, it talked about environmental, it talked about social. Talk about some of those 3 pillars and how, since that plan has been in place and you're getting close to 2020, what's been executed well, what has not in terms of
Well, and we continually fine-tune that plan.
Okay.
The Board of Mayor and Aldermen meets and retreat twice a year, generally January and August, and we kind of test the 2020 plan. And you mentioned, again, the 3 pillars, and we didn't use the word sustainability, but each one of those, social, environmental, and economic, we want to see how we can sustain growth and also service levels. So, we look at all different things from public safety. Many years ago, that's one of our major priorities in our city. So in 2005, we looked at adding a 6th police district and 7 new commissioned officers. So we always look at those things and how do we not change the values of the plan, but how do we change the workings of the plan?
And Germantown, like all the suburbs, spent a lot of time in the news in the last couple of years with consolidation and deconsolidation. And we don't need to necessarily go back through that whole history, which we talked about before the show, about how much this show is focused on that really important history. But there's still this open question, or this, or I don't know if it's an open question, but it's an unsettled situation for a lot of people in Germantown, that 3 of the Germantown schools are run by Shelby County Schools, not by the newly formed municipal school district. What's your opinion of that situation, and do you want to see it changed? Where does that stand?
Well, it's an emotional issue, very much so. I like to refer to those schools as our heritage schools. I really don't like the 3G name, but so many people have pride because they sent their children to Germantown Elementary, Germantown Middle, Germantown High School. And quite frankly, a lot still do, because in Germantown now we have choice in public education. If you like programming at Germantown High School, whether it be their new optional program or their established IB program or their fine arts program, you can stay there, or you can choose to leave the Germantown Municipal District and go to the Shelby County School District. So parents have a choice, but to get back to your original question at hand, I think that the contention and the combativeness, the legal fighting that we experienced over the last year plus, That's all behind us. I had several people from SCS board that I've built friendships and relationships with in the last few years. I attended many of their meetings when they had a super board, then a pared down board. They called to congratulate me on winning the mayor's race. So we can have conversations, but that's really guided, Eric, by our seated school board. Separation of powers from a governmental responsibility standpoint. City government manages city services. Board of Education manages educational delivery. So if our Board of Education, and they represent the community at large, if they'd like to have further conversations with SCS, I'll be glad to help in that capacity.
What do you hear now so far with this kind of hybrid situation, which I'll call it, where some of the schools are run by SCS and some are run by the new municipal school district? What do you hear from parents? What do you hear from teachers, et cetera?
Well, and I've already met with 2 of the 3 G schools, heritage schools, their PTSA presidents. They're tickled to death that they've got great curriculum, great teachers. I think what they'd like to see more from city government in Germantown is more acceptance and more inclusion. We feel like we did some things that the city was not necessarily responsible for financially, but we have sent police officers, they're called SROs, into the 3G schools because we were providing that service beforehand when it was under the former SCS umbrella. We also pay for crossing guards, and we don't submit a bill for that. It's kind of a social responsibility. There's schools in our city. Let's make sure that we're providing some service, some care, and we want everyone to be safe in our community, and those 2 things are more public safety driven.
I guess, the worst case for Germantown, I would assume, you may have 2 different administrations over these sets of schools, but you want people are going to move to Germantown, you want the highest level schools across the board, I assume. I mean, that's in the long-term interest of Germantown.
A rising tide lifts all boats, I guess is the cliche. But we saw about 300 new families move into Germantown from South Cordova and unincorporated Shelby and Eads to be part of the Germantown Municipal School District. And we haven't seen really we haven't really seen any exodus of people leaving our community for educational choice. So, if you've got 2 great quality school systems and they're very competitive, they're just going to make each side work harder to provide the best service to the children.
And the municipal school districts that you are now running, your district, that you're running, how is that is off to what sort of start? I mean, this will be the first full year. Correct?
Well, it's off to a great start. Everyone's happy, excited. There are always some bugs to work out, from bus service to different type things. 2 of our elementary schools were in the top 5 3rd grade math scores, Dogwood and Farmington, in this whole region. And so, one of the other challenges we have in the future is, as a community, how are we going to define excellence in education? And is it to be number 1 in Shelby County, number 1 in the state, the Mid-South, the region, the Southeast? So that's another thing that I'd like to do in 2015 is put together an educational task force and understand what excellence means. We could use that word, but if you can't manage what you can't measure.
Well, as you all took over, I guess there's a combination of factors, but it certainly was partly the schools that you all did. Germantown did a big tax increase in the last cycle, up to, what is it now, $1.93. Germantown, historically, all the suburbs have been known for, or have billed themselves as, good education, safe, low taxes. But does it concern you as a mayor that your tax rate is getting close to $2 and the city of Memphis rate is around $3.40, that difference isn't as big as it used to be? And where do you see those tax rates going down the road?
Well, that's a fair question. Anyone who's in office doesn't like to use the T word at times. But, our people in Germantown, when we had to manage our growth and determine what revenues would be for the next few years, when we passed that tax increase, not very many people sent emails or made phone calls. Our people in Germantown tend to practice a value proposition. If they feel like they're getting quality services, then they're willing to make the investment to pay for those. The tax increase, what we've done in years past, going back to '94, we plan in 5-year budget cycles. And in '94, we had a 5-year budget cycle, a tax revenue increase, and that lasted 10 years. In '04, another 5-year model that lasted 8 years. And so this 5-year cycle, right now, our city staff has told us we can stretch that to a 6-year. So my goal would be, how can we go back to the '94 to '04 timeframe and stretch that 5-year planning cycle to 10 years? And so that way people feel, again, like they're getting value. And right now our sales tax that we set aside for public education is handling that. And as we grow, we'll have to determine how we want to invest in education and other things within our city.
And Germantown, known as a bedroom community, and I'll throw out some stereotypes, and you correct me or agree with me, wherever. But I've heard people say that one challenge that Germantown has is that it doesn't have a big industrial base. It doesn't have a huge commercial base. I mean, it has lots of things that the Saddle Creek, and we think of shopping, we think of certain things, but it's very residentially dependent in terms of its tax base, which can be real cyclical in terms of, we just came off a historic bust, but housing goes up, housing comes down. Does that concern you when you look at this 2020 plan and, as you said, the 2040 plan, the maybe overdependence on a residential base for just sustainable tax base?
Well, we've tackled that for decades. The prior city fathers, mothers and fathers made the investment that Germantown would be a bedroom community, and it always will be. Some of our surrounding suburbs have light industry, light manufacturing. We have none of that. We have a very, very robust health community within our city. We have several hospitals that are anchored in several large clinics that are also anchored in Germantown. It does concern us as we plan for the future, because we're reliant on property tax to fund our city services. Roughly 60% comes from residential property taxes. About 16% of our budget comes from sales tax. If we can get that gap a little bit closer, get sales tax to closer to 20% of our revenue, then less of the burden is on the residential property owner.
Right.
Also, back in 2004, we really looked at and investigated, did due diligence on the term smart growth and modern urbanism. We're starting to see, after the economic bust of 2007, we're starting to see tremendous investment in our community. And this investment's coming from regions outside of the South. We've had 3 major properties sell in our community, one upscale apartment community, a senior retirement community, and a shopping center, all set record prices for per square foot sales. So those investors that are outside, they do their due diligence in our community. They see the public safety, education, they see good governing, they see strong household median income, and they're looking for a return, and it's not necessarily these properties weren't sold out of distress. So as we look at more about smart growth and more commercial development in our central business district, we'll take the stress off of our residential rooftops.
When you talk about smart growth, I mean, some element of that, and it's in the 2020 plan, and it's just on the streets, which is bike lanes, more pedestrian areas. The new, Wolf River opening that opened in the last, what is that, last year or two? Yeah, that you drive along that and you go, wow, this is a whole different kind of look for Germantown. How important has that been, that notion of connecting to bike lanes, connecting to the Wolf River, pedestrian-friendly sidewalks and so on? Has that been a nice, cynics might say that looks good in a photo and it looks good on a bullet point, it doesn't really matter, or has it been really well received, and does it increase value and attractiveness of Germantown?
Well, I think it is. It's one of those amenities. This is one of those points of I guess, being a little bit proud of your community. Back in the 70s, we were one of the first communities in this region to have bike lanes. Matter of fact, our bike lanes have been there so long that they've become faded. A few years ago, we invested in a new bike study to repaint our bike lanes, to snazz up the signage and that type of thing. We're also one of the first communities to have a greenway along the Wolf River, and now the greenways are everywhere. Matter of fact, our greenway connects with the city of Memphis.
Right.
We have an urban farm park. They're not any of those they're 2 in the state. So we've been very cutting edge. So to get back to your question, those things are real, and people that are moving into communities want to see that type of activity. Germantown has really transformed over the last couple of decades. We're seeing 3 generations of family stay in our community. My parents are retired. They decided instead of moving to Florida to stay in Germantown. You've got young families that are moving to be close to their parents.
Yeah.
And if you have the late 20-year-old, early the 30 to mid 30-year-old, they want some things a little bit different. They want more diverse shopping, dining. They want a little bit of entertainment. We've got GPAC that's pretty much very well renowned in our community and has a great programming. So we're bringing all those amenities together, and then how do we roll those out to our community? The 2020 plan will help with that, or 2040 plan.
Yeah, and you talk about the bike lanes, and we've talked before on the show with the whole effort on bike lanes and greenways and so on, and kind of the symbolism, or maybe the ironic symbolism, that in the middle of the big schools fight, very quietly, there was a connection, between the Germantown Greenway to Shelby Farms and so on, that was a no-brainer, that you all, and I assume as an alderman you voted on that.
Oh, yes.
So there's this stereotypical, this negative stereotype that of suburbs, that suburbs are, they are exclusive, they want to keep people out, they are built to be, we are not Memphis, we are, and that was in the schools thing got into that kind of fight, that this sense of exclusivity and separation. But not just the bike lanes, that's more symbolic. In general, can Germantown thrive without a thriving Memphis, or without a thriving Bartlett or Collierville? I mean, we said before, the cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats. Does Memphis need to have a rising tide? Is Germantown, is there kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two?
Let me tell you what, when I travel nationally, and I do some traveling for my job, I'm proud to be a resident of this region. I'm a citizen of Germantown. There's a difference. I work in Midtown. There's some great things happening all throughout Memphis, and we look at our neighbor to the east, the town of Collierville was just recognized for having the best town square in all of the nation.
Right.
And then you've got all kinds of things like Sears Crosstown and Bass Pro and the Renaissance of Overton Square. All these things make us proud to be in this MSA. I don't look at that. I think we need to break down some barriers and in essence practice a little bit more regionalism as far as communication, connectivity. And you're right, the symbolic side of connecting greenways, it's not, I guess, driving the silver stake at Promissory Point, but I mean, it really does. I mean, we are connecting. We have, matter of fact, there's several Germantown residents have been influential in the Harahan Bridge. 4 years ago or so, I was involved in just a social civic group, and we had the leadership speak to us about this concept, and everyone's like, oh, that's neat, that's neat. And a couple of Germantown residents were part of that. So, if we identify things that we can work toward as a greater region, you look at the MPO, which, is cross-jurisdictional, and things like that, that actually works.
Yeah.
It works well.
The MPOs, and we've had her on before, a number of people before, Metropolitan Planning Organization, and it funnels a lot of the state and federal money in a more regional sense in terms of looking at where these things go and connectedness and sort of breaking down. They're not as hung up on city boundaries within municipal boundaries. There is this, again, I'll just go down this, one more. When I moved to Memphis almost 20 years ago, it was at a time when people still talked about white flight. I mean, 20 years was a long time ago, and that to the suburbs, be it Germantown or wherever. Is that a stigma that Germantown carries, or are we just past that? I mean, am I bringing up old stuff when I talk about white flight or the exclusivity of communities?
Well, you would hope so. I think the trailing generation, and my daughter's 21. I don't think that generation, I don't think they see that, and I hope not. I mean, I pray that they don't. Again, the region right now is really starting to rebound, and so many people are coming together. So, again, that was a prior thought, and if you've lived here, I'm 50, I've been here for 46 years, so I'm pretty much a Memphian. And things do move in cycles, but you would hope most of that and all of that hopefully is past us.
I still remember we were talking about all the school shows, and before the show we mentioned on here when Mayor McDonald from Bartlett, and we were talking, and we got into some people talking about that whole fight about schools was about race, and Mayor McDonald, who's 60-something years old, said that he got, as angry as I'd ever seen him get on the show, but it wasn't very angry, and said, the future of Bartlett is one of color. If you come to Bartlett today, we are a diverse community, and we're going to become more diverse over time. We celebrate that. We welcome that. And it was an interesting, it was telling, I didn't think otherwise, but I'd never heard someone say that so passionately from the suburbs, that is our future. It's not something we embrace that. And I guess that's just the nature of Germantown as well as Collierville as well.
Well, I would think so. We're very proud. In Germantown, we have one of our Rotarians has put together an international festival. It's like 6-7 years old. And we've got tremendous cultural and ethnic diversity in Germantown. And we're very proud of that. And, our community thrives on many things that, we see things that are different, and hopefully we learn from all those things.
Yeah. We talk a little bit about competition among other communities, or and how you work together. There's an interesting dynamic right now that I'm sort of focused on. I'm curious your take on it, which is the fight, or the tension, the competition. That's the better word. The competition between North Mississippi and Shelby County and so on. That from an economic development point of view, Mississippi can do things, and it's not, somebody, a plant moves across the border or a warehouse is put in DeSoto County, not in Memphis. Maybe Memphis and Shelby County didn't do everything right, but even if they do everything right, even if they level the playing field between Memphis and Shelby County and DeSoto County, the state of Mississippi is doing amazing things and amazingly aggressive things to spur development there. Do you see that as a threat to Germantown on some level, that they as a state are just that much more aggressive than maybe some will say Tennessee is as a state?
Well, I mean, competition's competition, and that doesn't affect us as much. Now, we have pilots in Germantown, matter of fact. Now, we have two large national headquarters that are headquartered in Germantown. We just sent our planning director to the governor's conference on economic development. We're not as much a player, but we do see that there's a greater effect in this region. And North Mississippi, the warehousing area, I'm more of a casual observer from reading and that type thing. And I was a banker for 25 years, so I know a little bit about the side of finance and real estate and those type things. But yeah, I mean, Tennessee, this region, we're going to have to always keep our pencils sharpened to make sure that we compete with, we've always been in that situation. You look at the Med and different things, when you are bordered, have 3 states that border each other, there's naturally going to be intense amount of competition for all types of services. And so we just have to acknowledge that and try to beat North Mississippi in the state.
Yeah. Your race was very close. Some said unusually close. Others said, well, we hadn't had a race in 20 years. Yeah. So a race in itself is unusual. Yeah. What made that race so close?
Well, whenever there's a open position, in essence, or a retiring public servant like Mayor Goldsworthy, I think that there draws a certain amount of interest. And then also, when you have someone who's been an alderman for 10 years that is running on more or less a platform of prior work history and that type of thing, people are very inquisitive. A lot of issues came out in the race. And I think that people, the newness of having a new mayor, it led them to really question both candidates. 56, 58%. It's not necessarily an overwhelming mandate. You always like to get 60 plus because you feel like there is a mandate. But I think that the people of Germantown, spoke pretty clearly, and they want a continuation of good governing.
Did anything you learned from your, and I've just forgotten his name, the man you ran
George
against?
Brogdon.
Okay, thank you. Anything you learned from him that you say, as I come to the end of this, I have to say I think this influenced me in X, Y, and Z ways?
Well, I think one of the what came out loud and clear in the election is that the people want to be heard and listened to and engaged. And even times in governing, and probably any time in work when you have in customer service, in essence, in that type of field or industry, you always feel like you're transparent and you're engaged, but are you really? And I think that's one of the things that I learned from this particular race is that we really, and that's part of wanting to put this 2040 plan together. How can we get a large amount of our citizenry together and have them, come up with a new plan? They're engaged. You have 500 people, and they can be from either quote camps in the last election, and you do a certain amount of healing and bonding there.
Right.
Yeah.
Some inside politics on the board of aldermen right now. You have to be replaced. Mm-hmm. We talked a little before the show, but how does that process work, and when will that happen?
Well, when we're about to meet to identify, in essence, the process, the city charter is pretty clear. Once there's a vacancy, the city has 30 days to fill that vacancy. I'm sworn in December 15th and assume the duties of mayor on the 16th. So the clock starts then. The definition of how you, define the process is not really clear in a charter, whether you have an application process, leave it open to the community, to anyone that's a citizen that wants to apply, an interview, perhaps you have those candidates write an essay. I don't know, there's, that part is not defined, but we do know we have 30 days and that position has to be filled, and it'll be for the remaining 2 years of my term. And of course, there'll always be, we've already started to receive a lot of interest from the community, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
In this campaign, a lot of people were engaged, so people are stepping forward saying, I'd like to be considered. So it should be a
Yeah.
good pool of candidates or prospects to choose from, and I will have nothing to do with that. So that's a good thing.
And it is technically a part-time job, but do
Yes.
you have a sense yet that is it really a part-time job? I mean, is it, or is it you're gonna retain your job, work at Rhodes, you mentioned working in Midtown, you're gonna retain that job and be mayor at the same time. Do you have a sense yet whether that's doable?
Well, I think so. I've been an alderman for 10 years, and so it's always about time management. You go back to your college days and other things, whether you were in fraternity or you had a job while you went to school or you were in extracurricular activities. How do you balance all that? And it's all about time management. So many of the things that a mayor, whether it be Bartlett or Collierville or Germantown, so many of those obligations are based in meetings and oftentimes some ceremonies and that type of thing. And generally, those are done in manageable time chunks, and it's like I try to tell people during the campaign. If there's work to be done, I'll get it done.
Right, and just 45 seconds left. A real quick question, long answer maybe, but why politics? What got you into politics?
Well, besides having great parents that were educators, I went to a great college, Rhodes College, that's nationally known for community service. Part of the service word is on the shield of our college. We learn to be contributors to our greater communities. So it started there when you're part of the Kinney program at our school and you get involved in the community. It's just a passion that has continued to, flame with me to this point in my life.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. I guess I should say congratulations on your win. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.